Hi, everyone. On behalf of VMUG, I'd like to welcome you to today's Vali Cyber webcast, Hypervisor Threats, Don't Be the Next MGM, presented by Nathan Montierth, Threat Intel Lead, Joseph Comps, Threat Intel Analyst, and Megan Howard, VP Marketing with Vali Cyber. Before we begin, I have a few quick housekeeping items to go over. First, today's webcast will be recorded and available for you on demand. You will receive an email with the on-demand link, so keep an eye out for that. Second, a Q&A session will follow today's presentation. All questions will need to be entered in the question and answer section on the bottom of your screen and answered after the presentation. And lastly, there will be a short online evaluation that pops up as you exit the webcast. Please take a minute and let us know what you thought of today's session. Let's get started. Nathan, Joseph, and Megan, I'll turn it over to you now.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Matt. Appreciate it. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Let me go ahead and share my screen and we will get started. Let's see. Just a moment. Hey, Nathan, can you tell me if my screen is sharing?
Your screen is sharing. We see the presenter mode, so we can see like the notes for the slides and stuff.
Great. Let's figure out why it's not sharing the correct one. Give me just a moment. Try again.
There, that looks perfect.
Okay, great.
Okay, thank you so much, Megan. You want me to go ahead and jump off?
Go for it.
All right. So hello, everybody. My name is Nathan Montierth. I am the threat intelligence lead here at Vali Cyber. I'm really excited to be talking with you guys today about hypervisor security and how the threat landscape is kind of evolving around the hypervisor environment. I come from a background working with the U.S. government. I was active duty Air Force. I'm doing offensive cyber operations for about 5 years. And then I left that world after getting to do some pretty fun and interesting things. I left that world to come here and work with Vali Cyber on ensuring that they had the most robust protections we could have for hypervisors and also for Linux environments. I'm going to go ahead and turn it now to Joe to let him do his own introduction, and then he'll get started moving through some of these slides for us, and we'll get into the fun stuff here in a few minutes. Joe, go for it.
Great, thanks, Nathan. Hi, everyone. I'm Joseph. I go by Joe Comps. I have a somewhat similar background to Nathan. I was predominantly ground operations for Air Force Special Warfare for the past decade or so. But over the past, coming up on a year now, I've been working with Vali Cyber, and I'm super excited to talk to everybody about kind of exploring hypervisor security today. And, we're going to go over some attack chains, specifically like looking at what happened with MGM Grand and some other similar institutions, as well as demonstrating some attack chains on our own that we're gonna go over today. So without further ado, Megan, can we go to the next slide?
Yep, you got it. It's not progressing, guys. I'm sorry. I'm not sure why I'm having difficulties today. Let's see. Can you guys see that?
Nope. Okay, yep, there we go. Perfect. All right. So, I'm sure most, if not all of you, are already pretty familiar with hypervisors, but just to ensure that we're all operating on the same page, I'm going to go ahead and just cover a couple of quick definitions here real quick. So hypervisors are the software hardware layers that enable virtualization via multiple different operating systems working on one physical host. Now, there's predominantly two types, right? There's the ones that a lot of people are familiar with, which is the type 2, the hosted hypervisor that's going to run on an already pre-existing operating system, something like VMware Workstation, Oracle's VirtualBox, something of that nature. But then there's the ones that we're going to be focused on today, which are your type 1 or bare metal hypervisors, and those are directly interacting with the hardware to host those virtual machines. And those are hypervisors such as Hyper-V, Nutanix, or more specifically what we're focusing on today, VMware ESXi. Now, these type 1 hypervisors are used in enterprise environments, right? They're going to enable a lot of functionality, increase the scalability, enable disaster recovery capabilities, and ultimately they really are the foundation of what modern cloud computing is today. Slide, please.
It's still not progressing, guys. Do one of you guys have it on your machine? I'm not sure why it's not progressing for me.
Yeah, I think I can pull it up really quick. Let me give it a whirl.
Sorry for the technical difficulties, everybody. I was testing it this morning and it worked just fine.
Okay, let me see if this, let me know, you guys, if this shows up.
Yes, I have that on my screen.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, folks. Back one, please. There we go. Okay, so the interesting thing about hypervisors is there's this weird dichotomy is that they're kind of often overlooked when it comes to establishing a security posture within an infrastructure environment. However, they are an incredibly high impact asset. And this is why attackers love to target it. And we've seen this in a significant increase in attacks that are targeting hypervisors over the past few years. ESXi specifically tends to be the focal point of a lot of these attacks. And you know, the reason is that VMware kind of holds the significant market share of virtualization and hypervisors. As I alluded to earlier, though, that it being such a high impact asset, this means that when it is compromised, that results in an incredibly devastating blast radius. Now, this has been demonstrated in the recent MGM resorts and the Johnson Control hacks just over the past year that resulted somewhere to the tune of $100 million and $60 million in losses, respectively. So, you know, you're seeing that, you know, when the attackers are successful and they can compromise these hypervisors, it has a huge detrimental impact on these organizations. The other thing about, you know, to note about hypervisors is that while they are often overlooked, they are kind of difficult to secure in some cases. And this is, once again, kind of proven in a real world environment when recently MITRE experienced a breach involving their own ESXi servers. And it's kind of one of those things that, you know, if MITRE is having problems and they're kind of the ones that are writing the book in terms of the cybersecurity practices, it just goes to show you that, like, even these robust organizations that have very robust security standards are still having difficulty with that. So without further ado, you know, I'll kind of turn over to Nathan at this point to talk a little bit more intimately about what happened in the MGM Grand hack itself.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much, Joe. I think that everything that Joe was just talking about is very much true. The increase in the incidence of hypervisor attacks is definitely startling. And what we've really found is that there are three, and I think our slides are auto-progressing for some reason, so bear with me on that. The real reason for this usually boils down to three major initial access methods. And they're the ones that you see on screen. And the common thread between these three initial access methods is that they're really all due at the end of the day to human error in one way or another. So in terms of credential compromise, this can happen via phishing attacks or just plain credential theft as the follow-on of an incident and then not changing those credentials afterwards. Misconfiguration, oftentimes this is due to under-resourcing or a lack of training, which is usually not the fault of the system administrators. It's usually a more systemic or organizational problem. And then the last being vulnerability. Now, this is a little bit more esoteric and is probably the most mysterious of the three of these predominant initial access vectors. But vulnerabilities still are errors ultimately in code, or at least in what we think that code is supposed to do. There's some functionality that exists that either was not intended or was completely unknown. And unfortunately, all of these are pretty prevalent in the hypervisor environment. We see lots of misconfigurations because they're complicated machines, and oftentimes, like we were talking about before, some of those administrators maybe are not as familiar with the exact ways that all of their hypervisor settings are configured, or they just don't have the time. There's too much to configure. They don't have the time to pay as much attention as maybe we'd like to. So the first two of these problems are kind of known. We have a good idea of what we should be doing to protect, say, credentials and how often we should be cycling through them or how often we should be changing them. We also know what most configuration best practices look like. Usually you can get this kind of thing from vendors or from cybersecurity standards. And then vulnerabilities are much more of an unknown threat. This is something where we can do our best to try and mitigate vulnerabilities, but at the end of the day, especially in the cases of a 0-day vulnerability or something to that tune, we don't know what we're up against a lot of times with those. And it takes really robust behavioral detection and prevention to be able to get after that kind of initial access vector. We can't really blame the human element here. What we really have to do to respond to human error is make systemic changes. So we can do as much as we can to train the humans that are in the loop in this scenario. But at the end of the day, if we don't have systems in place that can help mitigate some of the human error that is inevitable, then we'll probably continue to have unmitigated risk in our environments. So what I want to do now is I want to take these initial access vectors, and I'll progress to the next slide here. Let's see if I can do it without getting it to do the auto advance here. I apologize for some of the technical difficulties we're having with slides today. And I want to break down a very brief, large-scale bird's eye overview of what happened in the MGM attack. And now we're going to harp on MGM a lot here. And it's not because they're a bad organization, and it's not because they don't have good security practices. The truth is that they do, right? They actually do have really good security practices. But we're going to see that no security solution or no security configuration or architecture is 100% perfect. So we'll do a little bit of an examination of what happened here. To keep things relatively brief, you can see that it's broken down on my slide here into about 6 major areas. And ultimately, the root of all of it was a credential compromise, if we're going to tie it back to one of the 3 things that happened initially. One employee was targeted. One of the IT admins in the MGM IT infrastructure was targeted, and the attacker was able to make a SIM swap happen. And this is something that's it's an interesting attack vector that we maybe don't talk about quite as much, because it helps us mitigate things like 2-factor authentication, especially when they're phone number based 2-factor authentications or multi-factor authentications. And with the prevalence of eSIMs, this is becoming something that's even a little bit easier. It's a little bit simpler because there's no physical component that's involved anymore. So it's a really, really interesting initial kind of social engineering attack that was put against this IT admin. But yeah, they took this targeted IT admin, did a SIM swap, and then they were able to use that phone number to call into the help desk, right, into their support help desk, and reset their 2-factor authentication. So once they were able to do all of that, oh, and I should note something else that's kind of I don't think that this is the most relevant. I think AI does get thrown around a little bit as kind of a buzzword in a lot of these scenarios, but it is interesting that they did use AI voice changers to try and mimic the voice of the particular targeted employee. I think that's worth noting. So we really would consider that, I guess, voice phishing at the end of the day when they were interacting with the support team to get that multi-factor authentication reset. Once they had that, though, they were able to gain access to cloud services, which really this was kind of the end of the game for them. Once they had access to cloud services, they had access to the domain controller, they had access to the ESXi hypervisor that was in that environment, and that obviously gives them access to all of the virtualized workloads that were running on top of the ESXi hypervisor as well. And from here, they launched a ransomware attack. And they sat and they waited for the money, basically, right? Which is the best outcome for a ransomware actor like them, is that they were able to hit an endpoint that was so critical that the organization really had no recourse if they wanted to stop losing money from having the downtime that they were having, other than paying the ransom and getting the threat actor to unencrypt their machines. So this is a really, I think, generalized example of what a ransomware attack against a hypervisor environment looks like in the modern age. This is obviously very, very recent. This happened just within the last year or two. And now what I think Joe and I want to do is we're going to transition into doing something a little bit more hands-on. So we have 2 attack vectors, and Joe's going to be modeling the first one, and I'll come in and model the second one. One of the things I want to highlight before we jump into them, though, is that they're iterative. So what we're trying to do is we're going to be targeting a company, a fictitious company that we're going to call XYZ Corp. And XYZ Corp is going to be targeted in 2 different attacks. Joe's will happen first in the timeline. And then after he's done his thing, the things that he did, and specifically, spoiler alert, the credentials that he's able to compromise, I'm going to use in my follow-on attack. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Let's see if I can do this pretty quickly here. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Joe, I'm going to turn it to you to get us into that. Oh, sorry, to get us into that first attack. Actually, I lied. I forgot. I'm going to show the first slide for you. Here we go. Hang on. Okay, Joe, take it away. I'll stop talking. You've got it.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Nathan. Yeah, so exactly what he's saying. In this fictitious scenario we're going to go through here, I'm going to be attacker group 1. And so we kind of already talked about some of the things that happened during the MGM Grand attack. So now we're going to show for attack chain 1 a little bit of a different attack chain, but still relevant to this type of environment. So as attacker group 1, I'll just kind of do a quick overview before I actually run through the demonstration. What I'm going to do is I'm going to conduct some initial reconnaissance. I'm going to find an exposed endpoint. From there, I'm going to do a little bit of research. I'm going to find a service that is vulnerable to an exploit that I have. I'm going to go ahead and launch an attack leveraging that exploit. Once that attack is launched and I gain a foothold in the environment, I'm going to establish persistence by creating an additional kind of a backdoor account, if you will. From there, I'm going to do some data exfiltration, which is really just going to be compromising those credentials that are going to be used for later on as a double extortion attack, if you will. And then my final goal is to launch ransomware against the ESXi server, encrypting all the associated files and VMs, and that'll be kind of my attack chain right there. Slide, please. Okay, so I'm not going to take the time to go through a whole lot of reconnaissance because that is incredibly time consuming, but this is kind of what it's going to look like for attackers, right? They're going to use OSINT predominantly, which is open source intelligence. So they're going to use tools that are readily available online for anybody to log in and implement and find. And they're going to take a lot of time if they have a specific organization that they're targeting. They're going to go after, not only the organization itself, trying to find, what kind of technology are they using, what kind of like email servers and protocols are they using. They're going to see what are the customers using. I'm sorry, not customers. What are the employees using? If they have any posted jobs. They're going to do their homework, right? Because time is really on their side. And so in this scenario, I as the attacker, I'm going after XYZ Corp. I'm going to use a popular web crawler amongst hackers and cybersecurity professionals alike called Shodan. What Shodan does is it just kind of crawls through the internet and it's trying to find endpoints that are publicly facing or publicly available that perhaps shouldn't. And on the right, if you look here, here's a screenshot of something that we searched just honestly last week, and it's pretty simple. You just type in, hey, I want to go after ESXi. And as you can see, it's, there's almost 40,000 exposed hosts that are just publicly facing right now, which is not exactly a small attack surface. That's a lot of exposure right there. And so in this specific scenario, I'm going to go down here and I'm going to decide to attack this company because I see that they're running an ESXi server and I see a version that is vulnerable potentially to an exploit that I have. And from there, I'm going to go ahead and take over screen share and kick off my part of the demo. And we're going to go with screen 2, please. Maybe. Okay. Nathan, can you see my screen?
Yep, I got you.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to log into my attacker box here, and I'm going after an ESXi 6.7 host right here. So I've already gained the information from Shodan. I have an IP address, and so what attacker's going to do first off is they're going to run some type of port service discovery scan. Now the de facto tool for this is called Nmap. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. And typically what an attacker is going to do is they're going to run a bunch of different iterations of this using different scripts and switches, scanning all the ports, doing different types of TCP and UDP scans. But for the purpose of this demo, we're just going to do a quick one here. And so I noticed that I've got some a handful of open ports and services here. This is important for attacker because not only is it showing services that they could potentially exploit in an attack, it's showing other ports and services they could use when they're conducting things like data exfiltration or creating these backdoors to kind of still implement that ongoing communication chain between that host. So I see that, the one that I want to target here is going to be port 427. But before I get there, I'm going to set up a listener here on another open port that I have, which is port 80. I'm going to pass the command to the host, and when I establish a connection, I'll know for sure that I do have that connection established. So from here, I'm going to go to my other window here, and I'm going to launch my exploit. Okay. So this exploit here, this is a remote code execution or RCE exploit that's based off of CVE 2021 21974 vulnerability. And what that is it's a heap overflow that is essentially looking for a section of process memory where it can overwrite the space with our command that we want to execute. The command being a reverse shell back to my listener. Now the service I'm specifically targeting, SLP on port 427. That's that service location protocol. What that does is it enables network discovery of like other services that are on the network. What's worth noting is that it doesn't actually require any form of authentication, right? So I can just hit that service as long as it's open and listening. And by default, it executes all commands as root. So that means I don't have to do any sort of privilege escalation. If I can gain access in a foothold, which it looks like I have down here, then I'm automatically a root user on that machine. So if I go back over to my listener, we can see, yep, I have a connection from this IP address. Sorry, I've got stuff popping up here. A connection from an IP address. And I can see that I am actually connected to the ESXi host. So that's step number one. I have a foothold on my target machine. You know, I'm going to want to go ahead and start compromising that host further. So from here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start enumerating. The attacker's going to start poking around and looking to see what they can find. What I'm most interested right now is password information, right? Because I want to leak credentials. So I'm going to go into the shadow file, which, you know, we have passwords stored in. And as you can see down here, I have two users with user hashes. I have the root user up here at the top, and I have another user, Billie Jean. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and copy those hashes for later kind of an offline cracking attack that I'm going to do. So I'm going to store them in a hash file that I will reference in a little bit here. So right off the bat, pretty quickly, as you see, I've already accomplished two of my goals. I've gained a foothold on the machine, and I've compromised user data. Now, realistically, an attacker is probably going to start doing, like, finding all sorts of other juicy details like trading secrets or anything else they can find on the machine. But for the purpose of this, I'm pretty satisfied with that. Now, however, as a somewhat savvy attacker, I know that my exploit is somewhat unstable. So the next thing I'm gonna want to do is establish persistence and gain a little bit more of a reliable foothold on this machine, because for all I know, the service might end up shutting off, or I might get kicked off. So I want to create my own user account. So what I'm doing here is I'm writing another user we're going to call guest to the password file. And I'm granting myself administrative privileges there because I want to maintain this root access that I have right now. And my next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to write, oh, sorry about that, folks. I'm going to write to the shadow file, which is what hosts the passwords that I just compromised. And I know that based off of the $ here and how this is all set up, that this is a SHA-512 password hash. I've already created my own password. I've already kind of hashed everything offline. So now what I'm going to do is verify that that has actually successfully been passed. Yeah, okay, so I see that my session is, or I'm sorry, that my account is added. So now what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and SSH into this box with my newly created account. Password here. Okay, great. So far, so good. That's my third goal. It's accomplished. I now have a persistent access via kind of a backdoor account into this machine. So now my final goal here is, my ultimate goal, we should say, is I want to get malware onto this machine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a HTTP server on my own attacker machine. I'm going to leverage one of those open ports that I found earlier, and I'm going to say, hey, I want to reach back to my server and I want to pull this malware sample onto the compromised host. And the malware specifically that we're going to be running right here it's a real world sample that is often used against ESXi environments called Trigona. So we'll go ahead and download that. And before I get to running it, typically what they're going to do is they're going to launch these either at root and encrypt everything, or they're going to go after the VMs specifically to try to shut down all the virtual machines that the hypervisor is supporting. But for this specifically, we're just going to, oh, sorry about that. Okay. So for this, we're going to go after just some text docs that I have in a different directory called files. So you see that these are just regular text docs. The plain text right there is a single string. But I'll show you kind of what happens when you launch an encryption attack against these. Okay, so it's going to take it a little bit of time to generate that master password and conduct the encryption. So while that's running, I'm going to switch back over to here, and we're going to, does everybody remember those hashes that I compromised? So now what I'm going to do is, as I'm the attacker and I'm waiting, I'm going to see if, can I actually crack these hashes, right? Which is just a different type of encryption, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to launch another commonly used tool by attackers called Hashcat. I'm supplying it with a word list of previously compromised credentials, common passwords that people use. and I'm going to use this word list, and I'm going to essentially brute force guess these hashes that I have here. And I'll switch back over, and it looks like my ransomware has successfully been launched. So now I'll go back to this folder, and you'll see, if you guys can see that what once said, test.txt and all that stuff, now I have a bunch of, strings and gibberish, and it says they're locked. I have a ransom note over here that the malware drops that says, oh, if you want your stuff or decrypted, you're going to have to contact us, pay the ransom, email us and everything. And then if I pull up one of these right here, you can see that what once said, test.txt and all that is now just a string of encrypted nonsense. So really, really bad day to be XYZ Corp. But it's a good day to be me because I've successfully encrypted. And now we look over here, and I check on my cracking attempt, and okay, it looks like I do have a hash here that's cracked with a pretty simple password, password 123. And so it looks like that belongs to user Billie Jean. Get on here, hashcat is exhausted. That's okay, hashcat, I am too. But so yeah, now I'm going to take these credentials that I've compromised, and as the attacker, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to post those on a public website, or I'm sorry, on a dark web site, and see if anyone's interested in buying it. And that's one type of the double extortion attack. And the other point is the main goal, which is I've encrypted XYZ Corp, and now I get to sit back and wait for my payday. And that is my attack chain. So I'll turn it back over to Nathan.
All right. Thank you so much, Joe, for showing off that attack to us. And yeah, really it comes down to that at the very end of the day. For Joe as an attacker, he was able to get everything that he wanted out of that. And now he really does just sit back and wait for the money to come in. He has two different ways that he's hoping to make money off of this. He's got both the ransom for XYZ Corp, and he's going to be selling the credentials, via an information broker or just via some site that he maintains on the Onion network. But one way or another, he's going to just be waiting for those paychecks to come in for all the nefarious deeds that he did. And as along the way, we probably saw that there were a lot of ways that they could have protected themselves, right? Disabling the SLP service, doing any number of other things probably to try and lock down account permissions, prevent new users from being created, protecting specific files. But the truth is that it's kind of hard to do a lot of that on hypervisors at this point. There's not a lot of great security solutions that are focused on hypervisors. We will touch a little bit on why Vali Cyber is helping to solve that problem at the end of our presentation today. But before we jump into too much of that, I do want to start talking about our second attack chain. Bear with me here for just a second. I'm going to get screen set up again. And let's see if this works. Okay. Let me know. Can you guys see my screen okay? Okay, great. So now let's talk about attack chain 2. We're going to say that a couple months have gone by. XYZ Corp has responded to the incident that Joe had. They've been able to get their hypervisors back up and running. They may have paid the ransom. They may not have. They may have just tried to restore from backups. But one way or another, they've taken some level of hit, both in finances and in reputation. And unfortunately, for a lot of organizations in this day and age as well, they might even be taking a legal hit, depending on how the victims and maybe the customers of this organization have responded. There have been lawsuits that have been levied against organizations for ransomware attacks that are similar to the one that Joe just showed against their hypervisors. But now I'm going to come in as attack group 2. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin by buying credentials from Joe. So I'm going to go and I'm going to find the passwords for that Billie Jean account specifically, though, if I don't know if you guys saw the name in there, if we called that out, but I'll buy the credentials for the Billie Jean account. I'm going to use those to attempt to log into the domain controller, and then I'm going to see if there's a good way for me to pivot from the domain controller into the ESXi machine. Now, there's a lot of assumptions that go into an attack like this, and we can be pretty upfront about those. Like, for instance, saying that we have network access to the domain controller. There's a lot of different ways that can happen, whether it's through another exploit to say one of the networking devices in their environment, through another employee phishing type scenario like we saw in the MGM attack, or straight up just through misconfigured network problems. So in the Shodan screenshot that I think that Joe showed you in one of his previous slides, those are all publicly accessible ESXi machines. So it's not even too much of a stretch. It is a major misconfiguration, and I would hope that most organizations, without a very, very good reason, are not leaving their devices, like say their domain controllers or their ESXi hosts, publicly accessible on the internet. It would be what I would consider in most scenarios a pretty big misconfiguration, but unfortunately it does exist. there are far too many of these machines that are just publicly accessible, like what we're seeing here. So we're going to pivot into that domain controller. Then we're going to try and get access to the VMware ESXi environment, and then we're going to do what's called a living off the land attack. Now, the way that this is going to differ from what Joe did is that I'm not going to be bringing in my binary. So you saw that Joe downloaded a Trigona malware sample, and what that does is it makes it really easy and very, very quick for him, without a lot of work, to just execute that binary and have it go through and run all of the encryption that it needs to extract that ransomware. Most ransomware gangs or ransomware threat actors that we see have their own version or an affiliated version of a ransomware encryptor binary that they'll bring into environments, and they'll use that to actually run the ransomware attack. The reason that I'm going to be doing something a little bit different is because XYZ Corp has learned a little bit from the first incident, and now they're not allowing those binaries. We're going to say that they're not allowing those binaries on these machines in some way, whether or not that's via monitoring network traffic or whether it's through some kind of runtime monitoring solution that's looking for new executables being brought into these environments. One way or another, they're not going to do that. So instead, what I'm going to do, and this is going to be kind of a cool attack, is I'm going to use only utilities that are already extant on the ESXi host to do the encryption. So I'm not going to be bringing any new binaries. I'm specifically going to be using OpenSSL, which probably most of you listening are familiar with because it's one of the backbone binaries / libraries of modern open source cryptography. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and launch into the first step of my attack here, which is just that getting those credentials, right? So I'm not going to display this part because we don't actually want to pay any threat actors for any credentials. And at the end of the day, I'm just getting this from Joe, right? And so this is an example of what some of these places might look like. These are not paid. These are not paid ones. These are just like open data leaks that have different credentials associated with them, or some of the data that's come out of some of these hacks associated with them as well. So this is just an example of how an attacker might get this, or where they might exist, to show that, hey, these sites do exist. People are using them, and a lot of them, the kind of lower equity ones, are publicly accessible. So having shown that, we're just going to say again, I bought my Billie Jean credentials from Joe. I'm going to stop sharing and switch over to my virtualized environment here so that I can show you guys now the technical part of this demo. Give me just a second. All right. Let's see. All right, I'm gonna do the check again. Can you guys see what I'm looking at over here? Okay, great. Seeing head nods. So what I've got here is I've got an Ubuntu Linux machine that I'm going to use as my attacker workstation. And you'll see 3 windows opened up here. This is going to be our last one, where we're actually going to do the SSH into the vulnerable ESXi machine. This is the web interface for the ESXi machine that I know exists in XYZ Corp's environment. Now, unfortunately, right now, I can't log into it. I don't have any credentials for this. Instead, what I have are credentials for the domain controller specifically. And I happen to know that the ESXi machine in this environment is Active Directory domain joined. So that means that its login credentials are being managed by the domain controller. So there's probably going to be a way that I can pivot. Now, the unfortunate thing is I have to come in over RDP, which is one thing. This is kind of a par for the course for, I think, for domain controllers in general. This is going to be one of your remote access methods, is just via remote desktop. But I was able to use, as you can see, I had it pre-configured to where it had the Billie Jean credentials. You can see bjean being the user that I'm logged in here as. And now I have access to this domain controller. Now I know that Billie Jean only has requisite permissions to create groups. I'm not an ESXi admin by default. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a very specific vulnerability that was really outlined in CVE 2024-37085. This is actually pretty recent. Where there's a misconfiguration. And so we're going to go back to kind of those initial access vectors and how attackers typically gain their footholds in these kinds of environments. There's a misconfiguration and a kind of a human error thing that happens by default within ESXi machines, or at least it did until the very most recent versions of ESXi. And how this one works is that basically for any Active Directory joined ESXi host, if there is in that Active Directory a group called ESX admins, which I'm going to go ahead and create right now. If there is a group called ESX admins, I'm going to add myself, Billie Jean, to it, because I know I have the credentials for Billie Jean. Let's check for names. Then any users who are part of the ESX admins group, by default, will have administrator privileges on that Active Directory joined ESXi machine. So I'm gonna show you kind of how this works here in just a second. Let's just double check. Let's make sure we've got Billie Jean added as a member of that ESX admins group. We can close this connection, go back to my my attacker workstation here. And now what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and log in as Billie Jean on the ESXi machine. Tell Firefox not to save that one. And it looks pretty promising so far. Let's see what happens. And look at that. We've got my domain, Vali, Billie Jean is logged in here. Now, part of what's really interesting about this is now I have administrative access to the entire hypervisor. So there's all kinds of nasty things I can do. I can look at the Gandalf, Frodo, and Gimli machines that are running on this ESXi hypervisor. I can see the users. And I want to call something out here that's really notable, is that the Billie Jean user does not exist on this device because it's only an Active Directory joined user. So the ESXi machine is doing this entire thing through this the Active Directory vulnerability that exists here. And this is something, again, there are numerous. This is not at all a weird situation to find yourself in as an ESXi admin, especially if your organization is using Active Directory for, say, like role-based access controls and that sort of thing. Usually this is a great tool. Usually this is something that really protects us, but unfortunately, due to this very specific vulnerability, now I have access, I have administrative access to ESXi, even though my user, the Billie Jean user, is not an administrator within Active Directory. The only thing that Billie Jean was allowed to do in that Active Directory instance was create new groups and add themselves to those groups. That was it. Those are the only permissions they were configured to have. And now using that, I've been able to escalate my privileges onto this ESXi machine. And to make this a little bit more permanent, what I'm going to do is, because I'm an administrator on the ESXi machine, I can just change the root password. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to change the root password. Here we go. Make sure I don't fat finger anything here. And then the other thing that I want to do is I want to make sure that SSH is enabled. So let's take a look. Okay, SSH is enabled. It's running. That's good news for me as an attacker. So now what I'll do is I'll say, okay, I'm done using the web UI. I'm going to come down here. I'm going to use the local network address here. I've got it preloaded in my history, but I'm going to use the local network address here, this 192.168.175.168 address that I know is associated with the ESXi host. And this time I'm going to log in as root. Let's see if we can do it. It looks like that password change took. So now, as an attacker, using only those underprivileged credentials that I bought from Joe for the Billie Jean user on the domain controller and using CVE 2024-37085, I now have root access to the ESXi host. So I can do basically whatever I want. So from here, I've got some, just to make life easier, I've got some stuff I'm going to copy and paste over so we don't have to watch me type for too long. But we're just going to do a quick ls on the Gandalf machine, just to look at what it looks like right now. So we can see all of the files that we would expect to see associated with a virtual machine within ESXi are all here. We can see a VMDK file, VMSD, some log files, and the VMX file that the ESXi latches onto. Okay, great. This all looks normal. And we know those virtual machines were not running because I had that network access up here. If we go back and we look, we can say, okay, they're not running. That means it's going to be a little bit easier for me to mess with it. In a real environment, we probably would see them running, and all the attacker would have to do is go back here and say, hey, I want to select all of these and I want to power them off, right? So super, super simple from the attacker's perspective. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do that living off the land attack. And I'm going to try to get this into my terminal without running it immediately so I can break down for everybody exactly what's happening. And it's a long command. But what I'm going to do is, instead of bringing in a new binary, I've got one line. I've got one line of essentially a bash script that's going to act like ransomware for me. Now, I say one line, and it is one line of bash script. It is obviously several commands that are separated by semicolons. But let's break down what those commands are. We got a grep, so we're just going to search for all of the files associated with the machines on this ESXi host. We're going to pipe that into xargs, which is then going to take each one of those files, put it into OpenSSL, and then it's going to run AES 256-bit encryption on it. We have this kind of cute password over here, bad ransomware, right? Because this is obviously just a demo. We're showing it to you guys. And then at the very end, what it's going to do is it's going to append, sorry, I'm going to highlight this so you guys can hopefully see it a little bit better. It's going to append this nuclear radiation symbol to the end of it. And this is, again, very normal tactics for what we see happens in ransomware attacks. Putting new file extensions on the end of things, removing the old files, using strong encryption, that sort of thing. So we're going to run this, and it is going to take just a minute. It's going to take a minute because it has to do several operations, right? Like I was talking about, there's several commands associated with this one-line bash script. But even though this environment was not allowing new executables to be running on their hypervisor, I'm able to circumnavigate any kind of signature-based detection because I'm simply using utilities that are already extant on this machine. Okay, we get a couple things that are not permitted. That's fine. They're just kind of weird system files that are associated in that particular volume. But let's go ahead and let's just like look at the files again that we have in the Gandalf directory here. So we can see that the vast majority of them have in fact been encrypted. We see that nuclear radiation symbol has been appended to the end. So again, for me as an attacker, all that's left for me to do now is leave a ransom note, tell them how I want to receive payment, and then we can negotiate unencrypting their machines. And I just wait for my paycheck again as a threat actor. So another pretty bad day for XYZ Corp. And we can talk a little bit about why things ended up the way that they did. But I want to highlight how quick this was for me too, right? Like if you guys notice, it's probably been about 5 or 6 minutes since I took over showing this, how quickly a threat actor can gain access to an environment that has a hypervisor in it, as long as they've done their prep and they know what that environment kind of looks like. This is the kind of thing that we see happening in hypervisors. I am going to go ahead and stop sharing real quick. We'll switch back to the slides. We'll wrap it up. And then I definitely want to leave some good time for you guys to have some good question and answers. So give me just a second here to get the slides pulled up again. Okay. And right here. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about how you keep your hypervisor secure. The unfortunate answer, as you'll see if you're familiar with security and if you are reading the slide, is that a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about are the typical things that you would be talking about for most environments. Keep things patched, disable unused services and ports, enforce strict password policies. These are things that are well-known security practices, but let's talk a little bit about how they apply specifically to hypervisors. So updating and patching all software systems and services. Unfortunately, this in hypervisor environments is sometimes a little bit easier said than done, because you have to think about the virtualized workloads that they're running. Because the hypervisors are the backbone of most virtualized environments and most cloud computing environments, it makes it a little bit difficult to schedule that downtime unless you have multiple redundancies and that kind of thing, which makes this a little bit of a headache. But it is a worthwhile headache to go through to ensure that you are using latest versions. The de facto way, especially that VMware will do mitigations of, say, vulnerabilities that get disclosed in ESXi hosts, is simply through doing entire version upgrades of ESXi. There's usually not a lot of like small patches that come out. And while that does make it a little bit more of a headache, it's crucial because unfortunately, both of the exploits that Joe and I used for our access today are rampant in older versions of ESXi in particular. That SLP exploit that Joe showed in particular is no longer a thing in the new ones, but something that I want to highlight. It's only, I think, 6.7 and before of ESXi. But something I want to highlight is that Shodan pull. If we were to go back to that slide, that Shodan pull that Joe showed before, just searching for ESXi last week, there were 5.5 versions of ESXi that were publicly accessible. Which just goes to show that the patching sometimes isn't happening. And we're kind of sympathetic with that because it is a little bit difficult. Disabling unused ports and services, for example, the SLPD service, or sorry, the SLP and the SLPD daemon service that Joe used in his particular exploit is another great example of this. This is now the default for newer versions of ESXi. VMware took notice of that very, very particular CVE that Joe used because it was widely used by ransomware gangs. And they made that kind of the default configuration for ESXi heading forward. But doing the same thing for other services that you're really not using, for instance, SSH. SSH probably needs to be disabled on most ESXi hosts, again, by default, unless you have a good reason for turning it on, and then only for a limited amount of time. And this can be applied to most services that run on hypervisors. Enforcing strict password policies. Now, this one I know that most security teams have a love-hate relationship with because of how much it annoys users. Unfortunately, it is still one of the best practices. One of the things that we can do is the next bullet, which is enable multi-factor authentication, which can help mitigate having maybe perhaps a less secure password policy. And then regular audits are obviously really, really good. These are even better if you can get them done by third parties of both, IDS, IPS, firewall solutions, but also just of your security configuration in general. Doing those kinds of things and ensuring that you have experts who do have the expertise needed to understand what the threats against hypervisors are is a great way to help mitigate threats. Now, I'll say before we get to this last bullet point and we talk a little bit about Vali Cyber and what we do, I want to say that nothing is a one-size-fits-all solution. When it comes to, and I'm probably preaching to the choir in saying this, in security, the risk of incident is never zero. But the best that we can do is we can mitigate risk, and we can provide as many layers of protection as possible to ensure that we are mitigating risk to the maximum extent possible, or at least to the maximum extent that our resources will allow. And with that, I will talk about one of the best, well, what we think is one of the most crucial layers now for hypervisors is runtime solutions like EDR. Now, you may be saying to yourself, there aren't any runtime solutions for hypervisors, and you would be correct if you were saying that about a year ago. But Vali Cyber has released Zero Lock for hypervisors, and I believe we can talk a little bit about it in the next slide, which is defense in depth for ESXi. We also talk about it being layered security for ESXi. Zero Lock is the first of its kind. We're the only ones in this space that are doing this kind of thing. And you'll see that we have things like SSH multi-factor authentication, which helps mitigate some of that credential theft. Oh, we got the auto advance again. That helps mitigate some of those things like credential theft and misconfigurations. We also have application allow listing, which blocks new executables as they're brought into a hypervisor environment. It's the reason that I had to do a living off the land attack, is saying that kind of thing was in place on that hypervisor. Lockdown rules, which are really, really interesting behavioral triggers that we can put into hypervisor environments to look for specific TTPs of attackers, say like shutting down virtual machines or accessing Etsy password or Etsy shadow, those kinds of things like what we saw Joe do. Those all have lockdown rules and Zero Lock associated with them, which means that we'll immediately trigger and undo all of the bad changes an attacker made if we notice them. And then our last line of defense with Zero Lock is really AI behavioral detection, which is the thing that looks for those unknowns. So when someone comes in and they run a living off the land attack, we still catch that kind of thing because we're not looking at static signatures. We're not looking at the binaries that someone's bringing in. We're just looking at the behavior. And if it does what ransomware does, then we stop it. If it does what ransomware does, we notice that behavior and we stand in the way and are able to even undo the file changes that happened before. Now, I don't want to talk too much about this because there's a lot of ways to secure hypervisors. We think that we're part of a complete breakfast, to quote the cereal ads, probably hopefully from many of your youths. But we're one part of a much larger solution when it comes to layered security in the hypervisor environment. Now, the last thing that I want to do is just kind of share with you guys, give you a chance to take a look and see if you're on Shodan, right? Like see if that initial scan that Joe did in looking, there's that auto advance again. If that initial scan that Joe did would expose your environments to it. It's worth a check. It's worth a check. This is probably the easiest basic audit that you can do, and it's free. Go on and take a look and see if your organization is there, either for vCenter, vSphere, or your ESXi machines. Hopefully you're not. But unfortunately, if you're on here and you can be seen, then you can be seen by not only the good guys, but also the bad guys. So we definitely want to advocate for taking your virtualization security seriously past that point. And with that, I think that more or less concludes the prepared portion of what we had for you guys today. We still have a few minutes. I think we have a little over 10 minutes to try and answer some questions. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for listening. We hope that what we've done was valuable. But I think we're ready for questions. Megan, Joe, anything else you guys want to add before we get into all that?
No, thank you so much, and appreciate it. Let's see. We'll jump into questions. And yeah, thanks so much, everybody, again, for bearing with us. Clearly, PowerPoint has beef with us today, and we got to dive into that. So our first question is from Derek, and he asks, how do you trick an employee to a SIM swap, to a SIM swap?
Great question. I can take this one if you want. Joe, do you want to take this one, or should I take it? Okay, so there's a lot of ways that this can happen. At the end of the day, a SIM swap is just trying to associate a foreign SIM, an adversarial SIM, with a phone number that is associated with someone's like multi-factor authentication account, right? So that's usually like, when you get a text from whatever service it is you're logging into, it says, hey, this is your one-time code or whatever. If an attacker can gain access to your phone number, and then they receive that text, that's kind of how this sort of thing works. Now, I don't know how many of you have changed mobile carriers recently. I'll try and keep this brief because it's an involved topic. There's a lot of different ways to let this happen. Usually it's via social engineering. So usually it's something where they do research, they try and figure out who your cell provider is, they try and figure out maybe what your security question answers might be, and then they contact your carrier and they get them to update your SIM with a SIM that they own. via social engineering, basically. So there's a lot of different ways. It's a pretty involved topic. This is actually something that there have been recent like advisories about. If you do a little bit of Googling into like SIM swapping, like a SIM swapping attack or something like that, you'll find some resources on it. But the short answer is essentially social engineering and doing open source intelligence gathering, like figuring out what your grandmother's maiden name is and that kind of thing from like social media and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, an attacker, like a motivated attacker, unlike a pen tester, right? Like they don't have a scope, so they're not limited to they just have to target their target company, right? So they're going to go after the employees. They're going to go after employees' grandma, the employee's cell phone provider. Like they're going to do whatever they can. So really, the target, even though XYZ Corp is the end goal, this employee is a vector in there, but that employee, okay, well now we're going to go after their mobile provider to try. So we're going to try and social engineer. They create this whole like an octopus with different tentacles of people that they're trying to compromise to get back to that center. So yeah, it's one would hope that it's a lot harder nowadays, with more cybersecurity savvy employees, but apparently it's still happening. So
yeah, good question though.
Yeah. Let's see. Sergey just says he'd love to get in touch with us. Sergey, we'd love to talk to you too. You can find us at info@valicyber.com. And we also have more information on our website, valicyber.com. That's VALICYBER.com. Let's see. Lori Lewis was asking, what was the CVE that you were referencing again, Nathan?
I think we referenced Joe. Did you reference yours as well? The SLP
yes,
one.
I'll go ahead.
We'll give you both.
Yeah, I'll type mine in there. So the SLP one, I just sent that. Oh, I'm sorry. Close the question.
It's okay. You can probably say
if you
it.
go to answered, you should be able to type yours as well. But
it's okay. My CVE, so the one associated with the ESX admins group thing with Active Directory and ESXi, Active Directory joined ESXi hosts, is CVE 2024-37085. So that's the CVE associated with mine. You can look that one up too. It's a fairly recent one. That was one that for this webinar today, it was one that I went and tried to figure out the ins and outs of and set up an environment where we could demo it, because I thought it was kind of an interesting one. It's really just privilege escalation. So it's not an initial access one. You still have to have access to the network somehow, some other way. But once you have access, it's a way of taking an unprivileged or an underprivileged user account and moving into becoming, an administrator on ESXi. So that's mine. Joe, did you find yours?
Yeah, so I went ahead and typed it, but in case you can't, Lori,
if you can say it for everybody so everyone knows, that would be great.
Absolutely. So that's CVE 2021-21974, and that is the open SLP exploit.
And that one, both of those exploits are ones that have been observed in the wild too. I'll note that. This is Microsoft, I think, released an advisory. This is part of what led to the CVE for the ESX admins one. They released an advisory saying that they had observed it happening on Active Directory hosts. They had seen people come in and run the commands necessary to create the group and then add someone to the group and then log into an ESX machine to do it. And the SLP exploit, I know for sure, also was associated with a lot of ransomware gangs. That was a year or two ago. So that one's a year or two old. The ESX admins one is pretty new. But again, we say it's old and it's within the last 2 years. so it's not that old. And unfortunately, there's still a lot of vulnerable machines for that one too. So.
Omar's got a couple of questions for us. He was asking if Zerolock does a vulnerability analysis and gives recommendations for server hardening.
Great question. So we do not do server vulnerability analysis as a service. We don't really do that. But we one of our recommendations for server hardening is have a runtime security solution running on your hypervisor. At the end of the day, we are a security vendor. That is our primary goal. We love to help our partners and customers with understanding what the threat landscape looks like and ensuring that their systems are secure. But we do not provide those services as a company. No, we don't do like vulnerability analysis and the like. But for those who are concerned about the security of their servers, we are happy to engage and talk about how we can help with that.
Yeah, and likewise, this is real tangential. He also was just asking if, in general, is there a way for the system to warn about vulnerabilities, Broadcom patches, updates, etc.
So as a clarification, are we talking about the system being the our Zerolock product? I'll say this as kind of a general thing, and maybe if you want to clarify a little bit what system you're referring to, we can get more specific. But as a general statement, I will say that one of the best ways that you can keep abreast of Broadcom/VMware security advisories is by following their security advisory like blogs. They have places where they post these. Doing periodic checks into those is a good idea. Also subscribing to oh gosh, I'm gonna butcher that. It's CISA, CISA, which is a government agency. They do regular email, like every day. Like every day they do emails about new and updated vulnerabilities and the systems that might be affected with them, and they also do like links to the organizations that are disclosing them and that kind of thing. That's a great resource if you just want to keep up to date in general about things. That's not Broadcom or VMware specific, but they do include advisories about those. So they release like daily, and I think it's actually multiple times a day, security advisories. My inbox is filled with CISA alerts. But yeah, I would definitely go to them as a general statement.
Yeah, and additionally, like Nathan, myself, and then the other members of the threat intel team at Vali Cyber, like we're kind of also clued into new and emerging threats and CVEs. So those lockdown rules that Nathan mentioned, we're regularly creating new ones. When a new CVE comes out, we're like, we'll kind of ping each other and be, all right, is this something we want to add to a new rules release? And those are periodic rules release. I don't know if we have a specific timeline on when those releases.
Yeah,
like
periodic is about every 3 months is how often we like to distribute them to customers. However, if there's breaking stuff that is a very, very important one, we push those to customers as needed. So that is a good that is also a good answer, Joe, for this question. Although we don't provide it again as a service of like advisories and things like that, we do have like weekly newsletters where we try to outline some of the things that are happening in the security landscape. Like again, for our customers, we try and keep really on top of the hypervisor, like ESXi and other hypervisor specific vulnerabilities, and ensuring that we have lockdown rules that are protecting against those.
Yeah, so the what Nathan was referencing was our weekly threat roundup, which is a weekly newsletter that hits every Friday and just kind of gives you a download of what's happening in the more specifically hypervisor security world, as well as some broader security threats that are impacting folks as well. And you can subscribe to that through the Vali Cyber website.
Yeah, thanks,
wonderful. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions, so I really appreciate you guys giving the time. Everyone who's joining us, I don't know about you, but I always feel like I'm watching like the bad boys at work whenever Nathan and Joe get together. It's always just amazing to see what they can come up with and do. I mean, look, like the two ways to get onto your system and cause some serious damage in under an hour. That is not great. I mean, great for them, but not great for everyone.
There are definitely things that could be done to stop us. There's definitely things that can be done to stop us, but yeah, make sure you do it.
Yeah. So thank you everybody for joining us today. And at this point, we will hand things back to Matt to close us out.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Nathan, Joe, and Megan for this great presentation. And to find out more about the VMUG webcast program, visit vmug.com and check out the webcast page. Please make sure to complete the online evaluation that will pop up as you exit the webcast and let us know how today's session went. And from all of us here at VMUG, thank you and have a great rest of your day, everyone.